Good afternoon, everyone. I have great pleasure introducing John Cottingham to you. John is one of the most important and deep living
Thank you.
philosophers. He has altered the face of the philosophy of religion by ensuring that it is religiously informed and humane. He's also a renowned figure in the history of philosophy and has recently completed the third edition of Western Philosophy, an Anthology. As one commentator put it, it is the best single volume intro into the writings of Western philosophy. John's creativity just grows and grows. His work never ceases to be original, radical, and decisive. He's a huge inspiration to all of us, and I have great pleasure in welcoming him to this seminar to discuss the question, which naturalism? John's going to be talking for about 50 minutes, and we'll close the session at the latest at about 10 to 6. So over to you, John. Thank you very much.
Thank you very much, Fiona, for those excessively kind words. And it's very nice to be here. I hope everyone can hear me. I can't see everyone, so no doubt people can indicate it. So there are 5 sections to the paper, well, really 4, and a brief concluding section. So the first is that the shifting concept, the changing concept of the natural. Naturalism is a notoriously slippery concept which covers many different positions. Brian Leiter, let me just get my hand out. Can everyone see that? This is A, quotation A, has spoken of the naturalistic revolution of the last few decades, based on the idea that philosophy should either emulate and adopt the method of successful sciences or operate in tandem with the sciences as their abstract and reflective branch. Now, that kind of naturalism is driven by a pretty uncompromising secular and materialist worldview. But materialist is another slippery concept. It comes in many varieties, and it needn't be crudely reductionistic in character. If you look at the next quotation by John Dupre, he points out that most materialist philosophers have entirely rejected reductionism. And he goes on to say that a more sensible materialism goes no further than the rejection of spooky stuff. Whatever kinds of stuff they may ever turn out to be, whatever they turn out to do, they are, as long as this turning out is empirically grounded, ipso facto not spooky. Now, I think Dupre is clearly right there insofar as most philosophers working in the sciences and indeed in philosophy generally, we'd find few who'd maintain, few even fervent naturalists who'd maintain that all statements can be translated without remainder into statements about the physical sciences. But the dominant naturalist paradigm, which now rules in philosophy, does seem committed to the idea that ontologically speaking, there's really nothing except for the material world studied by physics. Anything else, as Dupre himself says, must be outlawed from acceptable philosophical discourse as spooky. And crucially, he says only what is empirically grounded can escape being outlawed as spooky. But this just shifts the problem of defining naturalism onto a concept that's equally problematic, the concept of the empirical. And as the logical positivists soon discovered, now almost a century ago, and it's curious how often the debates over naturalism actually regurgitate some of the moves made in the arguments about positivism. as they discovered, it's very difficult to formulate a criterion for being empirically supported or confirmed by experience in a way that's liberal enough to include blue chip scientific theories, where the relation to what's actually observed can often be quite distant and tenuous, but stringent enough to rule out, for example, religious assertions, where their defenders can reasonably point to experiences in the life of the believer that go at least some way to support their claims. So if the naturalist is simply someone whose worldview is supported by experience, the term's not going to be much use in separating out different types of worldview. And this in turn prompts the thought that the interesting question in this area is not whether your view of the natural world is supported by experience, but rather how you conceive of nature and the natural world in the first place. If you are a naturalist, which naturalism do you espouse or support? Now, it's clear, I think, that Aristotle, the Stoics, Aquinas, Spinoza, even Descartes, all construed nature in much richer terms than the modern secularist. So far from being the heartless, witless nature of the poet Haussmann, so far from being just a brute concatenation of contingent circumstances and structures that is just there, in the immortal words of Bertrand Russell. For all these earlier writers, nature was something that partakes of the divine, or indeed, in the case of Spinoza, actually is itself divine. Going back to Aristotle, nature belongs in a metaphysical framework where, as Aristotle says at one point, nature does nothing in vain. The natural world is teleologically configured so that each natural thing tends towards the end wherein its good lies. Or to take another example from the ancient world, the Stoics told us to live in accordance with nature, vivere secundum naturam. And here, nature, so far from being an evaluatively neutral notion, means something governed by an objective, rational order. Indeed, living in accordance with nature means living in accordance with the same rational normative principles that govern the cosmos as a whole. Coming down to the early modern period, to Descartes, we find him saying in the sixth meditation, this is C. If anyone can't see the handout or can't hear me, please indicate, I guess by sending a message to Fiona. Here is Descartes. By nature in general, I mean nothing other than God himself. Remarkable phrase that, which I think most people, if we're given that quotation, wouldn't associate with Descartes. Or the ordered system of created things established. By my own nature in particular, I understand nothing other than the totality of things bestowed on me by God. Descartes makes it clear, as you know, taking his cue from Aquinas, that a vital part of our human endowment consists of the natural light, or the light of reason, which gives us access to what is objectively good and true. So all this, I think, puts in a slightly different perspective the naturalizing agenda of many of our contemporary secular philosophers. For when they insist that the human world and all its products have to be brought within the domain of the natural, they're advancing a thesis which many early modern and medieval and classical philosophers would think of as self-evident. So what's changed is not that there's a new determination to include within nature what was previously excluded from it, but rather there's been a radical shift in how the natural domain is to be understood. A shift, if you like, in the metaphysical construal of the concept of nature. So let me move on to the second section on nature and the supernatural. Contemporary naturalists often characterize their outlook in opposition to the supernatural. Supposedly it's opposite. So if you look at Julian Baggini, and he's come onto this theme in many of his writings, I don't believe in spooky, there's that word again, non-natural forces. Whatever is real has to be understood as fully part of the natural world. This aversion to supernatural or spooky forces turns out to be one of the main drivers of contemporary naturalism. Look at Richard Dawkins, this is E, in a book some of you may know called The Magic of Reality. Actually a beautifully written book, I think one of his better ones. To claim a supernatural explanation, not to explain anything at all. Even worse, it rules out any possibility of its ever being explained. And he goes on to say, if you call something supernatural, you're not just saying we don't understand it, you're saying we'll never understand it, so don't even try. Whole history of science shows us things once thought to be the result of supernatural, caused by the gods, demons, witches, spirits, curses, actually do have natural explanations. There's absolutely no reason to believe those things for which science does not yet have natural explanations will turn out to be of supernatural origin. That's Richard Dawkins. And there's evidently, I think, a lot of truth in his claim about the advance of science and its success in explaining phenomena once thought to be of supernatural origin. It may seem a reasonable extrapolation from this to see recourse to the category of the supernatural as dependent on the resources available within any given scientific epoch. So, for example, in the 17th century, the Cartesian conception of matter was simply extended stuff, res extensa, whatever could be characterized in terms of size, shape, and the particles described in terms of their size and shape. So from this perspective, motive power, energy, was in a certain sense supernatural, at least in the sense that it was anomalous, extraneous to matter as then conceived. And so for the followers of Descartes, since it couldn't be derived from the properties of extension, it had to be imparted to matter, imported or imparted by God. Yet, of course, as we know, as science developed, the idea of energy as something extraneous to matter in its natural state becomes progressively eroded. And from Einstein onwards, with the discovery of the intimate relation between mass and energy, matter starts to be considered as naturally, inherently energetic. So the boundaries of what is explicable in natural terms, where natural has the thin sense of intrinsic to matter, have dramatically expanded. Moving down to very recent times, the increasingly well-attested phenomenon of quantum entanglement is in a certain sense weird or spooky by reference to the framework of Einstein's physics, since it seems to involve the transmission of information faster than the speed of light. But we can certainly agree in the spirit of Dawkins' remarks that calling this supernatural would solve nothing. Indeed, I think it's hardly imaginable that any scientist nowadays would invoke God as the cause of quantum entanglement, as Descartes in his Principia 1644 directly invoked God as the primary cause of motion. I mean, the phenomenon of quantum entanglement is anomalous with respect to certain parts of the scientific framework, but it's taken to be something that further scientific theory and experiment will eventually resolve, rather than anything that requires us to posit the supernatural. So far, so good. So far consistent with Dawkins' remarks. But it's easy to slide from this very plausible truth about the explanatory redundancy of supernatural explanations in physics to a much more questionable claim that the methods and procedures of natural science are in principle equipped to explain the whole of reality. The problem with this more ambitious thesis, equating the limits of science with the limits of reality, is that there are plainly many parts and aspects of reality that simply don't figure in the world as investigated and described by natural science. To be human is to have access to a whole rich world of meaning and value, mediated excuse me, through a complex interlocking network of practices and discourses. Art, music, literature, philosophy, indeed scientific inquiry itself, all such work, its products, its characteristic activities, its discourse, and its subject matter form part of the reality we inhabit. And all the multifarious phenomena in question can't even begin to be explained or described in the abstract quantitative or mechanistic terms of physics or the terminology of the other natural sciences. The reasons for this have been much discussed in the literature, including a recent paper by David MacArthur, which puts one of the key points very incisively when this is F, when he observes there are truths about mind, meaning, and morals that, being rationally normative, constitutively depend upon non-scientific forms of understanding. Now, it won't do, I think, for the modern scientific naturalist to say, actually, as Dawkins does in that work I just quoted from, and here I quote again, yes, these things are real, but they depend for their existence on human brains. You know, these things like art, philosophy, music, scientific inquiry, a lot of common sense statements, but they depend for their existence on human brains. Well, yes, to be sure, all the complex phenomena just mentioned couldn't be conceived or apprehended if there weren't human beings, or beings like humans with brains or nervous systems. But while the cognitive faculties we possess as biological creatures may allow us access to this rich world, rich web of meaning and value, they don't in themselves create it or invent it. Rather, they allow us to perceive it and respond to it. So our biologically grounded and culturally shaped sensibilities, to borrow a phrase from John McDowell, they bring into view genuine aspects of reality that were there already. So if we take nature as the totality of the real world, comprising all the reality we apprehend, including the phenomena I've just been alluding to, how do we frame our conception of nature to do justice to this richness? I've just been saying that much richer conceptions of nature were available in the classical and early modern periods. And although there may be aspects of these older systems that are no longer acceptable for various reasons, it still seems we need an enriched naturalism or an expansive naturalism, to borrow a term from Fiona Ellis from her groundbreaking work, God, Value and Nature, 2014. We need to be able to count as real the value-laden, meaning-saturated aspects of the world we inhabit. And this needn't be a matter of introducing spooky forces or Cartesian ghosts into our ontology. It's not that there's the natural world and then there is an addition, weird, spooky entities. Rather, the thought is we need some way of accommodating the fact that the natural world, the world we human beings inhabit, is already replete with value. So let me come on to third section, in framing. If we accept the result just reached, the next step suggests itself is that in order to understand the value we find in the world, we need recourse to some kind of interpretative framework. Here I think we can usefully borrow, or perhaps adapt, we'd better say, the Heideggerian concept of Gestell, or enframing. As set out in his 1954 essay, The Question of Technology, Die Frage nach der Technik, this notion is initially deployed in the context of warning us about the danger posed by the technological revolution, the enframing constituted by the grip of technology transforms the world into a totalizing network of material resources lined up for exploitation. Everything is assessed in terms of its instrumental value. But Heidegger also indicates, citing a famous poem of Hölderlin, that where there is danger, there is also the hope of salvation. And this gives some support to a more positive interpretation of enframing. This is from, I think, a very interesting recent book by Federico Campagna, Technique and Magic, 2018. Anything that appears to us as a true element of the world, that is anything whose truthfulness, aletheia, the Heideggerian idea there, de-concealment, consists in the removal of the veil that hid it from us and its emergence as an object of our experience. Anything that does this does so within a certain frame. So as well as the kind of technological enframing that alienates us from the world, there might be alternative frameworks that are more benign, and indeed which enable us to perceive what is hidden. This appears to be what Heidegger suggests in a celebrated essay on the origin of the work of art, Der Ursprung des Kunstwerkes, where he emphasizes the power of art to disclose reality. Here is a different kind of framing, where a work of art becomes die schaffende Bewahrung der Wahrheit, the creative custodianship of the truth. Artistic creation is not merely a projection of our own wishes onto reality, but rather it is that which allows reality to manifest itself. In a later essay, The Thing, Das Ding, Heidegger produces a variation on this theme, where through the eyes of poetic imagination, even an ordinary object like a jug or a pitcher is seen as a vehicle of gift. The outpouring of a drink, H, the giving of the outpouring can be a drink. The outpouring gives water, it gives wine to drink. The spring stays on in the water of the gift. In the spring, the rock dwells. In the rock dwells the dark slumber of the earth, which receives the rain and dew of the sky. Highly charged poetic language, which continues in the original for a long time in almost ecstatic vein, celebrating nature, the natural world, as something with which we're intimately involved and united in a process of giving and receiving. But without unpacking all the train of Heidegger's thought, I think the relatively straightforward idea we can take away from this passage is that the very idea of nature and the natural world can't be understood as an unproblematic given to be characterized in colorlessly neutral terms. Its reality is something we strive to understand, to interpret, and this very attempt presupposes we come to nature already armed with frameworks of interpretation, scientific, technological, artistic, poetical. But equally important, in our interpretations, we also strive to be true to the phenomena, to allow what is real to be disclosed to us. And so far as one can see at this stage of the inquiry, I'll come back to this, there seems no decisive reason for privileging any one framework or saying that it provides an exclusive or exhaustive route to disclosing the true character of the natural world or reality as it is in itself. And I think actually contemporary philosophical secular naturalism is perhaps best understood as an arbitrary privileging of a certain kind of enframing or framework. So with that in mind, consider an alternative framework, alternative kind of enframing, this time a theistic one, which shows how the theistic vision kind of pervasively conditions the way we perceive the rhythms of the natural world. This is a Benedictine monk and also philosopher Luigi Gioia in a paper called Ascetical Practices for a Secular Age, number J there on the sheet. Liturgical activity transforms cosmic, historical, and biological rhythms into salvation history. The night becomes a time of waiting for the Lord, the rising of the sun, the time to celebrate creation, the succession of daily hours, an ascent to the heavenly Jerusalem, the end of the day, a celebration of redemption, sleep, an act of abandonment in God's hands. In this way, the monk constantly remembers he's not the creator and savior of himself, but that he's a creature in God's presence. He doesn't exist as a self, but as a thou. There's a sort of strange sense of calm and peace that pervades that description of the natural diurnal cycle of sunrise and sunset. It reminds one, or remind me a little bit of Wittgenstein's description of the religious outlook as involving, quote, a feeling of absolute safety. Nothing can injure me, whatever happens, end of quote. That may tempt us to characterize the difference between the theistic view of nature, what I would call theistic naturalism, and its antithesis, contemporary scientific or scientistic naturalism, by saying that the former involves, the theistic view involves an essentially benign view of nature, while the latter, the scientistic view, involves a view that's at best neutral, at worst perhaps, to use a phrase of Richard Dawkins, blind, pitiless indifference. That way of contrasting the two naturalisms may set things up for dismissing the theistic naturalism as a refusal to look facts in the face. How can the benign view of nature possibly be sustained in a world devastated by, for example, COVID-19, which looms very large for us at the moment, but in fact is just one item in an unending catalogue of earthquakes, tsunamis, plagues, famines that have marked the history of our planet and human history in particular. I think, this is slightly a digression, but I think the problem with portraying the theistic conception of nature as a refusal to face reality is that it involves a serious distortion of the way the natural world is actually described in the theistic tradition. If we go back to Wittgenstein, who described himself as having a strong sympathy for the religious outlook, even though he was himself unable to embrace it, in the passage where he talks about feeling absolutely safe, he goes on to stress this is obviously different from a feeling of safety about some ordinary matter, like feeling safe from whooping cough because you've already had it once. To an ordinary common sense way of thinking, you might well be safe from whooping cough because you've already caught it, but there are many other diseases you could get. So in a literal sense, saying you're safe whatever happens is nonsense. But Wittgenstein goes on to say this shouldn't lead us to dismiss religious language out of hand, since, well, he thinks sooner or later all religious language will run up against the limits of the sayable, the boundaries of language, but nonetheless demands deep respect, even though it doesn't add to our scientific knowledge. But in any case, and however that may be, I think if you look at the attitude to nature found in the theistic tradition, it's very far from asserting a comfortable, cozy, natural world where the forces of nature conduce to our well-being. The long catalogue of plagues and pestilences is certainly not airbrushed out of the story in the Hebrew Bible, quite the reverse. And the powers of nature are often such as to underline the wildness and threatening nature of the world, the lions roaring after their prey, fire and hail, snow and vapors, the gales that strip the forest bare. The natural world is awful in the strict and literal sense, in inspiring fear, and yet also filling us with a strange wonder and delight. Actually, it's notable that these are precisely the emotions that Richard Dawkins celebrates in his own account of the magic of reality. And he says, for example, just as the psalmist stresses the utter puniness of mankind, humankind, set against the backdrop of the starry heavens, so Dawkins declares that our local galaxy, quote, the mysterious streak of milky white across the night sky, which we can never see in its full glory, should, when you realize what it is, strike you dumb with awe, end of quote. So the sheer beauty and glory of nature that the theist celebrates by calling it divine, charged with the grandeur of God in Hopkins' phase, is precisely that which calls forth the awe and wonder of those who discard religious language. So I think there's a curious convergence here in our natural human responses to the natural world. A convergence, I think, which actually deserves more attention from philosophers than the largely fruitless attempts to rule in or rule out the supernatural, which occupy so much theistic debate in this area, theistic and anti-theistic. So let me come on to the fourth section, which is about human nature. Let's look at a particular subdomain of nature, namely our human nature. I referred earlier to Descartes, who, this is C2. By my own nature in particular, I understand nothing other than the totality of things bestowed on me by God. Now, as I mentioned earlier, the very rich, value-laden notion of nature, common in the classical, medieval, and early modern periods, very much extends to human nature. Human nature is conceived as partaking of the divine in at least two important respects. The first of these is the natural light, the lumen naturale, or lux rationis, in virtue of which we humans are endowed with the divinely bestowed power of rational intuition, enabling us, as Descartes puts it, to clearly and distinctly perceive the basic truths of logic and mathematics. The second is the light of conscience, which we look at the words of Joseph Butler in the 18th century, this is K, described as the natural, by this faculty, here's this word natural again, natural to man. He's a moral agent. Conscience is our natural guide, the guide assigned to us by the author of our nature. So when we compare these traditional views of theistically based views of our human nature with modern secular naturalism, we find considerable divergence. Theistic naturalism, what I'm calling theistic naturalism, despite the doctrine of original sin, according to both Augustine and Aquinas, we are clouded in our intellect and weakened in our will. Despite that, what is insisted on is a view of human nature that bears the stamp of the divine. How do we possibly evaluate that claim? We're clearly unable to follow the poet John Milton and eavesdrop on creation to check about our metaphysical credentials. So I suggest we take a leaf out of the pragmatist's book and ask, what is the cash value? What's the practical implication of this traditional doctrine of the imago Dei, the idea that we bear the stamp of the divine. I suggest there are two principal aspects. First, although we're obviously prone to error in many ways, the notion of the natural light of reason asserts, from Aquinas through to Descartes and beyond, that at least with respect to our most basic fundamental logical intuitions, we are equipped to discern the truth. This is how Descartes puts it in the second replies to the Meditations. In the case of our clearest and most careful judgments, if such judgments were false, they couldn't be corrected by any clearer judgment or any other natural faculty. In such cases, I simply assert it's impossible for us to be deceived. So on this view, at the most fundamental level, our nature is inherently responsive to the true. That's the first implication. The second is very close to it, that we're inherently responsive to the good. In a way, it's not distinct from the first, since goodness and truth are kind of interconvertible on the Thomistic view. So in the view of Aquinas, Thomas Aquinas, anyone who pursues evil, for example, bullying another human being, will nevertheless retain, in spite of him or herself, some residual pull in the opposite direction. Eleanor Stump has talked a lot about this in some of her recent writings. As she puts it, Aquinas is committed to the idea of an objective standard of goodness to which, at least in its rudiments, no human being can be indifferent to. And a striking conclusion follows, namely, as Stump puts it, no one can be wholehearted in evil. This is because someone who lacks one or other degree of integration in goodness will hide some part of his mind from himself, and so will be alienated from some of his own desires. So theistic naturalism presents a view of human nature which is strongly teleological. We have a destination laid down for us, which we're equipped, at least in principle, to discern and to pursue. So there's something we're meant to be, a way we are meant to be. We are, as it were, configured towards the good. So how does this twofold implication, affirmation of theistic naturalism, human nature fundamentally oriented towards the good and towards the true, how does this compare with secular naturalism of the contemporary variety? Well, perhaps the most prominent feature of secular naturalism as we have it today is that our human nature is shaped and configured by the engine of evolution, the mechanisms of random mutation and natural selection. This in turn suggests that our human faculties are configured in terms of functional utility for survival. Yet, as several philosophers have pointed out, this doesn't of itself entail or even make probable that the faculties in question will be configured towards the true. This is how Alvin Plantinga puts the point. This is M, focusing on the neural structures associated with a given belief content. For example, that the belief that there's a predator in the vicinity. As a result of having that neuronal event, the creature in whom this event is found also believes a certain proposition. But what reason is there to think this is true? Granted, the structure in question helps cause adaptive behavior, but that doesn't so much as slyly suggest that the content that gets associated with the structure is true. As far as it's causing the right kind of behavior, it simply doesn't matter whether the content of the associated proposition is true or false. As far as truth or falsity is concerned, natural selection just has to take pot luck. I think actually there are some problems with that argument, but the broad lesson I think is right, that on the typical secular conception of our human nature, there is no systematic principled linkage between our possession of equipment that's turned out to be beneficial in the struggle for survival and our supposed capacity to track the truth with respect to the basic intuitions of the intellect. So that's a problem about truth for the secular naturalist. There's a precisely parallel problem about goodness with respect to the moral domain. How could the contingent mix of survival pressures deliver a species equipped with the capacity to respond to the good, discern and respond to the good? This is explored by Bernard Williams in his Making Sense of Humanity, where he somewhat ruefully, it seems, reminds us how Darwinian framework presents human beings as a kind of ragbag, a mix and disparate amalgam of various genetically determined and culturally inherited propensities and dispositions, with no principled reason to think they will converge on a satisfactory vision of the good for humankind. The most plausible stories about human evolution, including its very recent date, etc., suggest that human beings are to some degree a mess. I think David Macpherson has talked quite interestingly about this passage in Williams, and the rapid and immense development of symbolic and cultural capacities has left human beings as creatures for whom no form of life is likely to prove entirely satisfactory. This pessimism is a direct consequence of what Williams calls the first and hardest lesson to be learned from the eclipse of theism and the rise of Darwinism. I think we can take away the lesson that the framework of secular naturalism is such as to make very implausible the idea of human nature as fundamentally configured towards the good. So in conclusion, the philosophically interesting question, I think, is not whether we should be naturalists, as I hope I've suggested, but which of the two naturalisms we should adopt. Secular naturalism, with its neutral or blank conception of the domain of nature as a whole and our own human nature in particular, along with its arguably pessimistic implications for how we see ourselves, or the theistic conception according to which both the natural world and our own nature bear the stamp of the divine. At this point, we could try to vindicate the theistic conception in a traditional way, of the kind, say, tried by Aquinas, of trying to construct a kind of metaphysical bridge to the transcendent, to prove the divinely created status of the cosmos. My own view here is that the Enlightenment critique of metaphysics has sufficient force to show there is little hope for that kind of metaphysical bridge to the transcendent, starting from where we are, position of imbecile worms of the earth, as Pascal called us. But where reason gives out, nature may take over, perhaps must take over, as the arch-atheist David Hume pointed out. to respond to the natural world with awe and wonder is a deeply ingrained human impulse, one which, as I've said, is found in atheists as well as theists. From that response, we may simply get a standoff. The theist saying that it reflects something fundamental, the atheist saying we're just projecting our own anthropomorphic wishes or hopes onto the backdrop of nature. So maybe when we're thinking of nature as a whole, the cosmos as a whole, we are left with a standoff. But when we turn to our own nature, I think things are rather different. There, it seems to me, I'll just end with this thought, the sense of ourselves as human beings as fundamentally configured towards the good and towards the true is one we may be unable to give up on pain of self-stultification. For our very sense of ourselves as scientific inquirers, able to critically sift and evaluate our beliefs, able to discern which goals are worthy of pursuit and to pursue them with coherence and purpose, all this seems to presuppose at some level that our minds are what Thomas Nagel, this is the final quotation, was called instruments of transcendence, able to grasp objective reality and objective value. In other words, whatever long evolutionary process may have given rise to us, our human endowment does include a faculty which is in principle capable of pointing us towards an objective domain of truth and goodness, where objective means something beyond our own contingent desires and inclinations, something which constrains and guides our choices. This, of course, doesn't mean we have a hotline to the truth or guaranteed route to goodness. That's ruled out by our many failures. But it does, I think, mean that in our view of ourselves, we are obliged, on pain of moral and cognitive paralysis, to have faith in something like the truth of what I've been calling theistic naturalism. If there's not within humankind something of what's traditionally been called the divine, something akin to what traditional philosophers have called the natural light, then we'd have to accept that there's no principal reason to hope that our intellectual and moral projects have a chance of success, or even that they can be coherently formulated in the first place. And these, I think, are hopes we couldn't abandon without ceasing to be human. Thank you.
Thank you very much, John. Fiona, you are muted. You should unmute yourself.
Okay, thank you. That's worked finally. Thank you, John. That was brilliant, as always. And I'm, of course, hugely sympathetic to what you're wanting to say. And I just want to begin with the first question, really, and then open up questions to the floor. So, I mean, you talked a lot about which naturalism we should be focusing upon. And I think you're right that that's a really important question here. But I think an equally important question concerns which theism we focus upon. And I mean, that's something that the two of us with friends have been talking quite a lot about recently in the context of thinking about, you know, Levinas, Spinoza, Iris Murdoch, Plato, different philosophers who've taken seriously a theistic outlook and have endorsed a form of naturalism in this context, but have wanted to resist your talk, for example, of waiting for the Lord. Now, I think this is really significant in the context of perhaps narrowing a bit the gap between the kind of theistic naturalism you're talking about and the kind of liberal naturalism that Mario would be very sympathetic towards. And I guess a key person here is somebody like John McDowell and his naturalized Platonism. And he's very much in debt to Iris Murdoch's true naturalism, which is a form of Platonism. But neither of them would want to go in the direction of theism in any Christian sense, perhaps not even any God involving sense, although I really don't think there's an absolute distinction between God and goodness once you bring Platonism into the picture. So in the light of all of that and some of the debates that have gone on in the last few years, I just wonder whether you have any thoughts about how best to articulate the theistic picture.
Thank you. Thanks very much, Fiona. That's a really, really important and interesting question. There are questions about liberal naturalism. I mean, in a way, I considered two extremes. And we've got versions of naturalism which don't go all the way to theism. I myself am skeptical about whether there is any halfway house, because it seems to me that these various conceptions which acknowledge something like goodness, Platonistic conceptions like Murdoch's, can't fully explain the idea of goodness as a transformative power that is active in our lives. And if they do true justice to that agency of goodness, its active power, then they're, as it were, forced to edge closer to theism. I mean, there's an awful lot there, which in a way is a subject for another paper. But on the conception of theism, which theism we go for, that is something I think which is increasingly preoccupying me, and which I think is a needful research program. I mean, roughly, we've got what one could call classical theism, the theism of Aquinas, which gives us a kind of framework conception of God as the ground of existence. God is that which makes the difference between existence and non-existence, and which has considerable affinities with Spinoza, I think. And what's sometimes called, on the other hand, theistic personalism, where there is some kind of relation, I-thou relation between the created and the creator. I suspect that most believers would be very reluctant to give up theistic personalism for reasons of spirituality, for reasons of what they need from the spiritual life. Although people like Brian Davis, for example, the expositor of Aquinas, have made a very eloquent case for saying we should indeed give up that conception. So there is, if you like, there's a sequel paper to be written called Which Theism?
Yeah, and I have sympathy for that view. I think it's really unclear what it means to describe God as personal, but I don't want to hog the discussion at this point. So I can't see anybody that has their hand up.
If you look at,
sorry, I think because you're not the host, the co-host.
Okay.
So I was the first, then Renaud. I can call the if you don't see them.
Yeah, and I'll unmute the persons. Yes, if you can call them.
Fiona, if you look at the list of participants, you can see hands there against some of the names.
I can do it if you want. Yeah. Renaud?
Also me, if Sophia.
Mm-hmm.
Yes, I think Mario did have his hand up first, but I'll go if this just makes things faster.
Okay, go.
And I can, so I can do it, that's fine.
Okay, so first, thank you very much for the talk. I suppose I'll try to raise two quick questions. One, it seems like the argument you offer at the end is something like denying certain things or accepting a certain view would be kind of intolerable or destructive. Consequently, we should accept it. But if we're going to talk about Plato, then I thought, well, why rule out the possibility that we need noble lies? What is so intolerable about the idea that it may be the case that certain truths are terrible or hard to swallow, and that we need certain myths? You might say that a lot of actual human life and flourishing depends upon fudging the details. Personal relationships, when we tell the story, probably contain a fair amount of myth or falsehood or exaggeration. We downplay the problems and the distrust, and we play up the love or the loyalty or things like that. Renan talked about the need to forget. So within large intergenerational groups, we have to tell myths in a way to remain together. So I'm not sure why we can't say maybe we do need a noble lie. What's so unbelievable about that? And then I'm just wondering if, on your view, people who want to have this kind of modern secular naturalism, should they all be anti-realists? Is that supposed to be the conclusion? They all have to be some sort of constructivist or anti-realist? Is that the kind of conclusion? So it's, either you're McIntyre and you can have realism, or you have to go the way of, Gilbert Harman and it's all just made up in our minds.
Thanks very much. Both excellent points. On the first point, I think my argument at the end is not just that it's unpalatable or unpleasant to think that we don't have this spark within us of discernment for the true and the good, but that to accept that would be, in a certain sense, self-stultifying. That's to say, the very activities on which we are now engaged, for example, conducting a philosophical discussion to sort out the implications of naturalism, we couldn't even embark on such. We can embark on a project of trying to weed out our mistakes and improve our thinking, but only on the assumption that there is a bedrock capacity in us to discern the true and detect the incoherent and the false. So I think it's simply you could mount an argument, kind of transcendental argument in a way that it's a presupposition of the possibility of inquiry. But as for the truth of that, it's something I think it's hard to sustain, at least on a typical contemporary secular naturalist view. Second part of your question about objectivity. Yes, I think attempts to construct the notion of an objective, well, let me put it this way. I think it's most easy for the secular naturalist to be consistent if they give up the notion of objectivity, whether in morals or in science, and go for a projectivist theory of goodness, as indeed many do. That's a position which at least has the virtue of being consistent. And that to ground the notion of a genuine objectivity, that which not of ourselves constrains us and guides us in our search, is going to be quite hard to articulate on a typical secularist view, where we just are a contingent mix of, as Bernard Williams puts it, to some degree a mess, a contingent mix of evolved faculties. So that's broadly the way I'd go in responding to that very interesting question. Thank you.
Mario next.
Oh, thank you, John. Thank you very much for your masterful lecture. Very fascinating. I have this question for you. So you presented an alternative between secular naturalism and theistic naturalism. But I think, as Fiona was hinting that there is a third middle ground view that, let's call it liberal naturalism, that seems very similar to yours. Oh, it's up to a point. It's anti-reductionistic, pluralistic, and accepts normativity as irreducible and so on. Simply, let's put it that way, liberal naturalists don't have faith and are not convinced by the arguments offered, for example, by Planting. I don't find Planting arguments very convincing because of the no miracles argument offered by Putnam, for example. So the idea that why should our beliefs work so well that we send people to the moon if our beliefs weren't true or approximately true. Anyway, the liberal naturalist is not very convinced by Planting argument. Then you offered a very interesting moral argument that I don't think it would be winning without faith anyway, because one could hope, but I don't think it's conclusive. And perhaps people, because of the problem of theodicy, could be unconvinced that there is an omnipotent and a infinitely good God out there. For these reasons, someone could accept your anti-secularist view, in the sense that anti-pluralist view, without necessarily accepting your theistic view. What I mean is, do you have any argument that doesn't appeal to faith here for going from liberal naturalism to theological naturalism?
Right. Thank you very much. That's a very, you put your finger very acutely on what I think is the central question arising out of the paper. And I certainly have great respect for the liberal naturalist position, of which you are a great exponent. It's just for the purposes of this paper, I just wanted to take the extremes. I think my reason for preferring the theistic picture roughly has to do with its unificatory structure. On what I take to be the liberal naturalist position, we have, as you yourself said, a kind of pluralism. We have to accept that, for example, that there is irreducible normativity, which is just there. Derek Parfit ended up with this position where he just said there are irreducibly normative moral truths. And I don't like truths, this is maybe just a prejudice, but I want there to be truth makers. I don't just want there to be a series of values and truths which we just somehow have to accept without further ado. And theism simply gives us a source, a grounding, and that for me is what tips the scales. It's not a very complete answer, but I mean, I don't think it shows the other view is incoherent. You might have to add in something like a Leibnizian principle of sufficient reason, which of course is coming from a theist anyway, in the case of Leibniz. But anyway, that's the way I'd go, I think.
Here.
Thank you. So the next person is Amber.
So thanks so much for this talk, John. I thought it was really interesting. And it's something that I'm also becoming more and more interested in recent years. Though my interest, and this is why, so Fiona kind of asked about like, well, which theism, right? And my question is more, which notion of nature and the natural? Because you touched on several of them during your talk. And I think when we talk about like naturalism writ large, we tend to think of like the natural supernatural distinction, which you touched on. We tend to think of human nature and stuff, but there's also like the natural artificial distinction, right? Or sometimes natural is used to mean without human intervention. And I think sometimes when you talked about the natural world, you seem to be using it in the sense of like the natural world versus kind of the human constructed interventionist world or whatever. Sometimes it's meant to mean without foreign influence. And sometimes, as in like a lot of contemporary discussions surrounding things as you know, a wide variety of things, it's like gender and sport, reproductive technology, you know, all over the gamut. We talk about things in this kind of way of that's a little bit more teleological, which you also touched on. And so I'd like to hear a little bit more about kind of the relationship between these various notions on a theistic naturalist view, because the way I understood it, at least as far as God is concerned, like God can still be like over here and the natural world can kind of still be over here. So like it doesn't imply, for example, that God is part of the natural world used in one sense, or that God comprises the natural world, that God has a body, for example, doesn't seem to be implied by your view. And when it came to human nature, we heard a lot about like the natural reason and, you know, being oriented towards truth and the good. I heard very little about bodies and the naturalness of bodies. Are they going to be constrained in this heavily teleological way as well? Is that how you want to understand naturalness arguments when it comes to kind of very concrete embodied things? Because that can get us into kind of tricky territory very, very quickly. I'll just kind of leave it at that.
Yeah, that's very interesting. Thank you. Yes, as far as bodies goes, I don't really, I wouldn't want to go back to, I mean, I think Bernard Williams, when asked about this once, said, we can't go back and be Aristotelians. You know, we can't think that all biological or natural bodies work to the good in some unproblematic way, because things so often don't work out well. Nonetheless, I think the idea that the natural capacities of things tend to their good is a tenable idea. The oak tree, the plant, the tomato plant, the animal, these embodied biological creatures do all seek their good and develop in such a way, barring things going wrong, as to realize their flourishing. So I think that kind of embodied teleological view is actually defensible. As far as the first part of your question, I mean, I think I probably agree with Fiona and the Thomists here, that I don't see God as a thing over against nature. That's to say, God is not an individual countable item alongside the countable items in the world. Rather, God is that which gives being and goodness to everything that exists and tends to its good. So that doesn't necessarily force us to jump off the natural world. Rather, it encourages us to see the natural world as held in being from moment to moment. You know, this very traditional theistic conception, from moment to moment, it would slip out of existence were it not sustained by a source of being and of goodness. Now, as to which nature, if one's asking how, for example, the nature of a human being, I'd very much agree with your suggestion that we have to take into account embodiedness, and nothing I said was supposed to push us towards a Cartesian or disembodied view of our nature. I mean, the fact that one's focusing on fairly abstract things like the good and the true does not mean that in that search, we're not searching as embodied creatures with a certain nature which we have to have to come to terms with. I mean, in that sense, I am an Aristotelian. I think if I talk about the soul, I'd prefer to talk about it as the form of the body rather than as a Cartesian ghost.
Thanks, Amber. The next person's Neil Williams.
Hi, yeah, thanks. That was a really interesting talk. I wanted to ask you about the natural light of reason, or whatever we want to call it. And I think I've found the idea quite convincing that without the natural light of reason, many of our scientific and philosophical projects just can't make sense. And you called it at one point a presupposition of inquiry, and I find that very convincing. I want to ask you about whether or not you think a secular naturalist, or maybe a liberal naturalist, might be able to provide an account of the natural light of reason. And I have an example. So Charles Sanders Peirce was really motivated by this idea, but provided an evolutionary story about how we might get these kinds of what he called natural instincts towards truth, logic, certainly kind of instincts towards logic and mathematics. Might be slightly complicated by the fact that Peirce certainly wasn't a secular naturalist in the way that you described it, but nor was he a theistic naturalist. So he thought that we gained these abilities, these natural lights, the natural light of reason, or these instincts, by virtue of having evolved over time in relation to the laws which we come to understand, either through biological evolution or through the evolution of generations of experience. So anyway, what Peirce is trying to do there is present a coherent account of how the natural light of reason arises without appealing to any notion of God. I'm wondering if you think that strategy is tenable. Is that an option for the secular naturalist, or would that already involve a move towards a non-secular naturalism?
Thank you very much. Yes, I'm torn about this. I'm not entirely happy with the Plantinga argument. I mean, I think he does succeed in showing that there's no principled reason to think that the random methods of evolution are going to generate these normative properties, truth-seeking, good-seeking. On the other hand, since evolution has to take place, as you said, in effect, against the background of a nexus of causes that will pretty quickly punish or penalize things which don't respond to appropriately to rocks that are coming at them, we would expect our capacities to be shaped to some degree by the way things actually are. So I'm just not quite sure what to say about this. I think at that point, probably the argument would shift. I need to look at Peirce, actually. I included in the latest edition of Western Philosophy, which Fiona mentioned, a bit more pragmatism than I had before, but I included William James on the ground that he's more digestible. So I need to look at Peirce, who I think is more sophisticated on the whole than James. And one would need to look exactly at how that argument works. But I think at that stage of the argument, I'd probably want to go back to what an earlier question has suggested, the very notion of the objective may be one, and this is something that Bernard Williams, as you know, wrestled with, trying to, and did in terms of the absolute conception, which was roughly a conception which any rational inhabitant of the galaxy or the cosmos would converge on. And he then saw an asymmetry between science and ethics because he saw no coherent hope for a similar convergence in ethics. I think we need both. I think to be human is to require both strands of that argument to be made good. But thanks very much for the question. I'll have to think some more about it.
Fiona, one thing, because the debate is going so well, we were with Sophia and Benedetta, we were wondering if we could add also the debate, recording the debate and putting it on YouTube. I don't know if John agrees, and the people who ask questions, if anybody doesn't want to put on YouTube, just write us and we'll cut their question.
Yeah, okay. So Piers Ben, next question.
Thank you. Thank you, John, for a rich and stimulating paper as always. And I suspect that my question's actually partly been asked by Mario already and by Neil, I think, but I'll try to ask it anyway. Hope I won't be wasting time. I mean, supposing that a truth-seeking atheist wants to know why he should believe in theism and accepts all of your strictures against scientism and against this crude, whatever that might mean, crude scientific view of the world as just containing atoms that knock and impel and so on. And they accept the idea that, yes, there is a world of values which are objective in some sense, which philosophers continue to argue about, but objective in some sense. And there's such a thing as truth, which is objective in some sense. And they're wondering why they should make this move from this sort of liberal naturalism to theistic naturalism. And they might say against your argument the following. They might start by saying, in a way, you've tried to make theism seem less intimidating, it might seem, by saying, oh, it's not really spooky, it's not really supernaturalist, it's not as frightening as you think. All this is caricature. The sort of thing Dawkins and company are attacking is a caricature, but it's not like that. Okay, now the response is to say, okay, I accept it may not be like that, but there's still a difference between liberal naturalism and theistic naturalism. Why should I make the move from liberal naturalism to theistic naturalism? Because, you know, however much you've tamed the idea of theism by saying it's not supernaturalist and not spooky, you've still got a potentially serious and big difference between theism and atheism within this liberal naturalistic picture. Now, I struggle with a lot of what you said over the years because it's very appealing in many ways. You want to sort of, you said a moment ago, a unificatory explanation for the reality of values and also facts of human nature, such as the fact that we seem to pursue truth and goodness. And I mean, I think I agree with you that Plantinga doesn't pull it off, but there's something there. Now, here's the dilemma I think you might be sort of impaled on. I mean, somebody could say, okay, well, I'll grant you theism, as long as you grant that theism is actually nothing more than to say that there are these real values and there are these genuine facets of human nature, which we can all see because we can be liberal naturalists with all rejected sort of scientism and the spooky, whatever those things are, by the way, but that's another issue. So we all agree the world's like that. There's a given. It contains all the rich, wonderful things you say. And if theism is that claim, okay, we'll be theists. But I don't think you do want to say theism is that claim. And you said in other seminars that theism is both a kind of blended theism, God is somehow manifest or infused in reality, but is also transcendent. Now, the atheist is going to want to say, well, how do you get to theism as opposed to what we can all agree on? Okay, let's suppose it's value. Suppose the world just contains values. Now the atheist will say, well, how does God confer those values? And what's God got to do with it? Now we're back with an old problem that we've often discussed before. You can go down the sort of divine command route, which I think you reject, though which has life in it. I mean, there are people defending it, but let's suppose we reject that. You could go for the conferral view that Philip Quinn, I think, has advocated, that somehow God confers the value properties on things that are valuable, and if God hadn't done that, they wouldn't be valuable. Or you could simply say that values are a fundamental feature of reality, in no special need of unificatory explanation. So there's this problem of how theism is supposed to help with this, if theism is something more than something that can be simply reduced to the world of value, which I don't think you do think. So, I mean, no doubt it's a confused set of questions, but it's all the same thoughts I have when considering your thoughts on this.
Yeah.
Thank you.
No, thank you very much, Piers. Yes, this is very difficult. And I suppose going back to pragmatism we were talking about earlier, a pragmatist might say, well, you know, forget the fine metaphysical distinction between your kind of realist and a theist. What's the cash value? And if the cash value is some kind of allegiance to the ideas of objective truth and goodness, then let's just run with that and not bother too much about how we dress it up metaphysically. I mean, I think there are two answers to your question. One is the answer I gave before, a preference, a prejudice, if you like, against pluralism. I mean, you used several phrases like there just are values in the world, there is a world of value, and there seems quite a bit of ad hocery about that. We have these things called values, but of course all explanation must stop somewhere, so there has to be a terminus. So you could just say, well, why not, as Derek Parfit does, stop with irreducible normative values without any truth maker? And you could go that way. Ultimately, if I'm absolutely honest, I think that the preference for theism is more than a philosophical preference. That's to say, and I've discussed this in some of my recent work about the idea of humane philosophy, which is philosophy which takes account of poetic, imaginative dimensions of our experience. That there's something about the spiritual life which I find attractive because it resonates with me on more than just the intellectual level. That's to say, the language of scripture, the language of traditional theism, with its parables, with its metaphors, with its history and quasi-history, I find moving and integrating and healing. So there's a lot motivating the choice beyond just the philosophical preference for a very unificatory theory which links together goodness and truth in some kind of grounding framework. So I think that would be the honest answer, but I don't think it takes us entirely outside philosophy, because I think there are philosophical reasons for embracing these other sorts of human sensibility other than the purely intellectual. But that would be subject for another paper.
Sure,
But,
thank you.
It's a great question. Thank you.
Thanks, Piers. Next question is Paolo Costa.
Oh, thank you. Thank you, Fiona. Thank you, John, for your brilliant talk. My question goes back to a discussion we already had elsewhere, and it revolves around the relationship between rationality and disenchantment. So when you mentioned those familiar phrases referring to spooky things or Cartesian gods, I was reminded of the key role played by disenchantment in our community, I mean, the scientific community. And well, this disenchantment looks a lot like a habit of the heart, it's quote Tocqueville. So I was wondering whether you would rely on an externalist explanation to make sense of this attitude by tracing it back to the success of Max Weber's master narrative of disenchantment as a necessary precondition for rationality. So in short, do we need to re-enchant a bit our view of rationality or not? So thank you in advance for your answer.
Thank you very much. Yes, that's a fascinating question. I mean, I think a lot of the appeal of contemporary secular naturalism is, and you see this in writers like Richard Dawkins, but many others, is the idea that it's sober, hard-nosed, looking facts in the face, not swayed by human needs and fears, and linked to a tightly organized scientific methodology. But it's interesting that in some of his recent writings, including the ones I quoted today, Richard Dawkins has been at pains to stress the enchanting nature of reality and wants to say, look, we atheists are just as susceptible to the wonder and beauty of the world, and indeed that the processes uncovered by science are themselves wonderful and inspiring of awe. I don't know where the disenchantment, re-enchantment agenda quite is located at this point. I mean, I think increasing number, Sam Harris, one of the other, four horsemen of the atheistic apocalypse, is another case of someone who is very keen to stress the wonder of existence. The diagnosis of that, I think, has to be that these are very powerful human impulses, and that any worldview has to do justice to them. The world isn't just a concatenation of neutrally describable properties, and that very austere mathematical vision, which was the great 17th century vision, maybe has to be abandoned in favor of something richer. But as to whether that leads us in a theistic direction of necessity, I guess we have to say no. I think we have to find a way of re-enchanting the world, because the disenchanted world described by Weber is a kind of vision of hell in a way. But I don't think there's a coercive argument from the need for re-enchantment to a theistic conclusion.
I mean, could I just add something there, John? A lot of secular thinkers will say that the only way of re-enchanting the world is by dispensing with God. But I think that that's precisely because they're operating with this within this dualistic framework. So they make a distinction between secular enchantment and divine enchantment. And divine enchantment is a kind of enchantment that is imposed from without, in just the kind of problematic way that you were describing and rejecting at the beginning of the paper, really. Yeah. So I think a lot hangs on the question of how we think about God in this context. And when we talk, as you did at the beginning, about a convergence of views with respect to wonder and awe between atheists and theists, I think you're right that diagnosis is required at this stage. And I think that one of the explanations for what's going on is that a lot of, well, the atheists are operating with a conception of God that I think we just need to question and shouldn't be taken for granted. And you're questioning it too. But I must admit that when you talk about wanting external truth makers, it makes me wonder why the liberal naturalists couldn't simply say, look, you've got all the truth makers you need at the level of value. And except I then want to say that you've got God at that level as well, because I'd want to reject that dualistic framework that makes it look as if we've got to make a choice between either divine enchantment or this worldly enchantment.
Yes, I don't think I used the phrase external truth makers.
No.
But no, I do, I agree with most of what you're saying. And it's interesting, I think, that a lot of theologians and philosophers of religion, as I know you are, and Claire Carlisle's another example, are working at deconstructing the rigid distinction between immanence and transcendence. In effect, if immanence and transcendence are better understood as two sides of the same coin, that points us towards something like panentheism, perhaps, where the world, all of the world is in God, but there's still some kind of asymmetry in that God is taken to be infinite, and therefore to exceed the totality of, in some sense, of exceed the totality of created things. But I mean, this gets us onto another paper, really, but it's important that humans have the concept of the infinite and that they cannot grasp it, so that there is something which we have some sort of conception of, but which we cannot comprehend. There's something which as it were is part of us, and yet which exceeds our capacity. Now that doesn't necessarily lead us to an external God out of it all, but it leads us to a transcendent God, I think. But a God which is nonetheless manifest in all the realities of the world, especially but notably in the things which have value and beauty.
Yeah, and Piers just made a point that truths about values do need truth makers, but they don't need God necessarily. And really was the point I was wanting to make as well on behalf of the non-theist in this context.
Yeah. Thank you. Yes.
Okay, are there any more questions? Amber, you want to come in again?
Yeah, sorry, this just occurred to me because I was thinking this is a total about face, but I think you did a lot of good work in your talk, kind of noting how the notion of like the natural supernatural distinction is rather unhelpful, how we don't really have a good grasp on what counts as spooky and what's not spooky, if that's going to somehow define what is naturalism and what is not. I'm curious whether you think there could be a version, multiple versions actually, of theistic naturalism, on which it would be, especially given the focus that you have on being truth-oriented and so on, whether you could accommodate things that are often ignored by philosophers of religion, like ghosts and demons and saints reappearing, or various kinds of things that are generally taken by some of these folks to be spooky entities, literally spooky entities. And if we really want to take something like the primacy of praxis seriously, this is something where like people are really engaged in religious practice with these kinds of quote unquote entities. Can theistic naturalism accommodate that? Would that be okay? Is there a principled reason to rule out any of these forms of theistic naturalism on your view, or would they all be kind of permissible versions of a different kind of theistic naturalism, as it were?
Right. That's interesting. I mean, tradition, Judaism and Christianity have traditionally been pretty down on spooks, ghosts, communing with the dead and all that stuff, and have insisted on the mainstream of the tradition insists on a fairly austere path to righteousness. I mean, I'm no theologian, so I shouldn't really, but one which resists shortcuts in the form of magic, or magical answers. I mean, one interpretation of the temptation of Christ, for example, is the resisting of easy supernatural magical solutions to life's problems. So, I mean, and it's also, I think, the case that the kinds of religious feelings and emotions I've talked about in my work in connection with poetry, the Psalms, music, and so on, that these are not of a kind of spooky variety. They're rather ways of tapping deep human emotions and responses that are very much part of the natural, our natural endowment. That's not to deny the existence of these other phenomena, but I think it's to say that they're not as central to what it is to take a religious view of the world as many of the critics presuppose.
It's a really difficult question, isn't it? I really don't know where to draw the line. And when you think about, for example, Rilke and his use of angels, and you feel that there's something legitimate about that, and everything may hang upon the question of interpretation, or some of it, I find this fascinating.
Mm.
But then I'd also probably, and you wouldn't, I don't know, what would you want to say about miracles, John? Would you want to rule them out?
Well, I think that there are prior questions to be settled about the nature of language and how we understand much of this language. And again, part of the spell of scientistic naturalism is that we construe truth entirely in terms of literal, verifiable, repeatable phenomena or descriptions of. Whereas it's clear, I think, to anyone who's has even cursory acquaintance with literature, with poems, with some of the world's great scriptures, that you just don't get it if you try to translate everything into a protocol statement or a...
Yes, so maybe that is the best kind of response here then, that there's a way of responding to this or interpreting it that takes us back to scientism and makes our relation to God sound like telekinesis or something. But that literal way of thinking about it just is inappropriate to this level of explanation or something.
Yeah, I think that's right. And I'm struck by how many, I tend to read more theological writings than I used to 20 years ago, how very much most currently working theologians shy away from literalism. And in their interpretation, they simply refuse to take a proposition out of a context and say, is it or is it not true? I mean, it's partly a Wittgensteinian approach, I think, that we have to understand these claims of religion in the context of a whole form of life. So it's partly a holistic form of understanding and partly a resistance to certain kinds of literalism.
Yeah, thank you, John. I think we're coming towards the end of the session now. Is there one more question before we bring the discussion to a close? Anybody else that I may have missed? No. So thank you very much, John, for a wonderful session, and thank you everybody for some wonderful questions and discussion as well. And we've got the next session, I think it's on the 23rd of April, Mario, isn't it? And it's me giving a paper on the meaning of life and desire and the meaning of life. And yeah, be here or be square. Mario, over to you.
Can I just say before, thank you so much, everyone, for the questions, which are really fascinating and a lot of food for thought. I'm most grateful. I'm glad we've got a recording because hopefully that'll give me a chance to ponder on some of the questions some more. Okay, thanks.
Thank you. Bye-bye.